Fate Zero is the 2011 anime adaptation of the four-part light novel series of the same name, written by Gen Urobuchi in 2006. It details the events of a ritualistic magic tournament known as the Holy Grail War, a kind of superhuman conflict where 7 powerful magi, called Masters, each summon a legendary hero from myth or history onto the earth as a kind of familiar known as a servant, then use their power to fight one another to the death, with the promise of an omnipotent wish to be granted to the victor. It's a prequel to the 2004 visual novel Fate Stay Night, and thus is designed primarily to set the stage for the events that would take place in that story. And anyone who played even the start of that game could tell you, it was never going to have a very happy ending. It was a story where, for its target audience, the destination was never the important thing. It simply wanted to engage us with the story of the characters and the various tragedies that befell them as they risked everything for one chance to make the impossible possible. In making that effort, Fate Zero wound up becoming one of the most engrossing anime series of my recent memory, and ever since I saw it, I carried a desire to talk about it in a form like this. Now, I've never made a YouTube video before, and while I practiced a lot in the construction of this one, I apologize in advance for the myriad ways this one may fall short. I'm probably not going to make a habit out of making them, but I always wanted to try my hand at it. And with 2017 being the unofficial year of Fate, with the series' popularity at an all-time high and my personal urge for discussion on it stronger than ever, I knew now was the chance to compose my analysis on the characters and have a healthy discussion on the narrative of one of my favorite shows. So here's how this video is going to work. I'm going to give a brief overview of the primary characters and themes of Fate Zero. I'll try to include information from the proper novel, the anime adaptation, and any source material I could find to present the characters as properly as possible. I'll also include my personal thoughts on the characters, their actions, and their motivations. If you disagree with my assertions or have access to information I didn't have when making this video, all I can say is awesome! I can't stress enough that discussion, as well as information, is the primary purpose behind this video. I'm one of those asocial hermits you hear about who uses places like YouTube as a false simulacrum of an actual social circle. So having the chance to discuss the stuff I love with somebody else, even if they disagree, would be pretty awesome to me. Anyway, I think that'll do for introduction. Just a friendly reminder that, as an analysis, this video will contain spoilers for the Fate Zero plotline. If you haven't seen it yet, well, I can't recommend it enough. So head on over to Crunchyroll and watch the whole thing for free, or end up like me and spend 2 months worth of rent getting the show on Blu-ray. Either way, get familiar with the series and then come back and check this video out. I'm going to go in order from the ones furthest outside of the central core of the story and then work my way in. And with that, the best place to start is definitely the team that never quite manages to be as central to the story as its various members wished, Team Lancer. I'm going to go ahead and begin by giving an abridged synopsis of the legend of Diarmid. This isn't going to be typical of how I explain the characters going forward, and it's going to result in the Lancer section being a tad longer than the others. But in the case of Lancer, the fact that his legend is repeating itself in real time, regardless of how hard he tries to resist it, is the central conflict of his character. So being familiar with the legend itself helps one to appreciate the tragedy of his story going forward. Diarmid was a warrior of the Fianna, named for Fionn, the wise and aged leader of the band. He was a peerless warrior, going into battle with a spear and sword in tandem, and fighting with such ferocity that he could single-handedly turn the tide of battle even against superior numbers. Unfortunately for Diarmid, he was also given an unusual gift after a night with a woman who turned out to be the personification of youth. A common occurrence in Celtic mythology, maybe? Anyway, she placed a spot on his forehead, which had the effect of causing any woman who gazed upon it to fall in love with him. That gift was more or less his undoing, as one day his aging Lord Fionn decided it was time to get over his deceased wife, and decided the best way to do that was to wed the fairest maiden in all the land, Grania, ignoring the small detail that she was technically so young as to almost pass for his granddaughter. Now, Grania, for her part, was about as excited about the prospect of marrying a far older man as you would expect, And when she gazed upon Diarmid's face, she was almost mercifully placed under the sway of his enchanted love spot. She approached the young knight, begging him to run away from the Fianna and elope with her. Diarmid wasn't without pity for the girl, but his oath of fealty to his lord was everything to him, and he refused her request. Grania, deciding that if asking nicely wouldn't work, she'd just have to get more dramatic, cast a geas upon Diarmid, compelling him to fall in love with her. This caused him to relent, and the two ran away. And then they were caught. Fionn was just a tiny bit incensed that his most loyal soldier had betrayed him for his fiancée, and wanted satisfaction right there and then, but the other knights of Fianna interceded on Diarmid's behalf, arguing for his tremendous bravery and loyalty, and the sorcery involved in his betrayal. This did cause Fionn to back down that day, but deep down he never truly forgave Diarmid for the attempted flight, and it was this grudge that would lead to the young knight's death. You see, sometime later, Diarmid would be critically wounded while hunting a wild boar. Fionn had the power to save him, as any water he held in his hands became a miracle elixir. Again, Celtic mythology, it's unique. Fionn would walk the short distance to a nearby stream, scoop some water into his hands, but subconsciously allow the water to slip through his fingers as he was walking back to Diarmid. This would repeat 3 times, becoming something of a darkly comical act of passive aggression. He was finally able to control himself on the 3rd time, but returned too late, and Diarmid had succumbed to his injuries. The circumstances within the confines of the Fourth Holy Grail War aren't quite identical to this legend, but they're resonant enough. Taking the role of Fionn is Lancer's master, Cainith el-melloi Archibald. Now, Cainith is a character for whom I find I have a much greater degree of sympathy than most people. Don't get me wrong, he's a world-class scumbag, ever scheming and condescending, always convinced he's far more clever than he truly is, and right when you think he may have finally suffered enough to deserve a little good old audience sympathy, he invariably performs some new scumbag action that drains away any goodwill he manages to accrue through his endless suffering. He's like the anime equivalent to Cersei Lannister. At the same time, there's just something about his character I find so utterly pitiable. It's a bit more strongly implied in the books, but even in the series it's clear that while he takes tremendous pride in his status within the mage world, he doesn't derive any actual happiness from it. Pretty much the only thing in his life that seems to give him any genuine joy is his arranged marriage to his fiancée, Solau. But even that is undermined by the fact that it's clear from the first scene she appears in that she regards the man with barely contained disgust, and was clearly not pleased by the arranged marriage her family had set up for her. He doesn't even have an actual wish for the Holy Grail should he win it. He's a mage, certainly, so one can assume he may have the default mage wish of using the Holy Grail to access the Akashic Root, but even that's unlikely. He seems to want the Grail simply so he can have the prestige of being the mage who obtained it. He's a man constantly climbing the social ladder, convinced in vain that greater prestige or adulation will fill the void of unhappiness that makes up the core of his being. Because of this, watching the events of the Fourth Holy Grail War play out, where everything he treasures is destroyed, first his relationship in the form of Solau falling in love with Lancer, then his status as a mage due to Kiritsugu's origin round, and even his status as a master in the Holy Grail War as his own betrothed tortures him for his command seals. I admit, some part of me did have hopes that he would at least manage to escape with his life when I watched the show for the first time. It becomes clear early on that even he's aware of how empty everything outside of his fiancée is to him, though, and his genuine devotion to Solau becomes his one endearing trait as he smug snakes his way through the Holy Grail War. Even the primary conflict of his character during the series ties back to how absolutely devoted to her he is. He interprets the legend of Diarmid to be the story of a lecherous retainer who abandons his honor to chase after the wife of his lord, which is a stretch, to put it lightly. I don't think a variation of the legend exists that doesn't explicitly spell out the role sorcery played in Diarmid's betrayal. To insist otherwise almost reeks of sophistry, which I think is exactly what it is. Cainith believes that Diarmid's legend tells the story of a treacherous lech, because for him, that has to be the truth. Lancer must be the one who is betraying him. If Lancer is truly loyal to him, then that would mean that it was Solau who was betraying him. And that wasn't a possibility Cainith could handle. since, again, everything that brings him happiness is tied back to her. He rejects reality itself in order to avoid facing the truth of his fiancée, and it's poor Lancer who suffers for it. This leads us into Solao, a character who's more wholly sympathetic than her betrothed, but also selfish and ultimately undone by her own shortcomings. Her primary conflict is hinted upon during her first appearance in the series, the aforementioned fact that she'd fallen in love with Lancer, and can only barely stand her actual future husband. Her first scene in the story takes place after the clash of servants in the warehouse district, where she promptly begins to undermine Cainith, berating him for his cowardice and only backing down when Lancer himself grows impatient with her words. It's here that the possibility that she has fallen under the influence of Lancer's cursed love spot is first implied. This is a plot point that's better explained in the original novels, but Lancer's love power isn't actually any particular threat to a female magus or servant. If the woman possesses magic circuits, she can simply circulate the mana within her body to purify herself from the effects of the ability. This is how Irisviel and Saber were able to continue fighting Lancer after just a few moments of discomfort during their first showdown. Likewise, when he realized that his servant for the Grail War would be Diarmid of the Love Spot, Cainith made sure to inform Solao of this weakness to his power. Thus, when it becomes clear that Solao has fallen madly in love with Lancer, the riddle for Cainith, and for the audience, is finding out whether she developed feelings for him of her own accord, or whether she willingly allowed herself to fall under the sway of his enchantment. The strong implication is that if the latter is the case, which reinforces the sorry state of her life up to that point in the story. Her marriage to Cainith was a political one for her family, who had entrusted their family crest to an unworthy heir, and now needed to marry their daughter off to a prominent mage family or run the risk of falling into obscurity. She was forced, through her own family's pragmatism, into an arrangement with a stranger, and was implicitly so miserable and passionless in this new life that she eagerly accepted even the illusion of passionate love with a servant. In case saying that didn't make it clear, I have a tremendous amount of sympathy for Solao. She is cruel to Cainith, and she abuses and manipulates Lancer to fulfill her own illusion of happiness, but both of these actions are born more of desperation to escape the trap her life had fallen into than any specific evil on her part. The fact that her primary source of misery is the source of Cainith's only happiness is perhaps the cruelest twist for the pair, as it guarantees from the start that there was no ending the Fourth Holy Grail War could provide that would result in both of them being happy. To this end, she fulfills the role of Grania in the modern retelling of the Diarmid legend, even going so far as to plan to use a command seal to compel Lancer to love her. I'm not actually sure if a command spell can be used in such an abstract way, but if so, it would have truly brought the legend full circle, and irrevocably doomed Lancer's only wish. Which finally brings us to Lancer. Look, Fate Zero is a tragedy. We're expected to know, going in, that no one has a happy ending, and the worst possible outcome will almost always be the one that plays out. Having said that, and even in this story with so many horrible things happening to so many undeserving people, I sincerely believe that the single most tragic figure in the entire narrative is Lancer. In his life, his heroism was undermined by the sorcery and cunning of others, and he was forced to die dishonorably due to actions beyond his control. When he returned to this world to represent his master in the Holy Grail War, he did so with no wish for the cup itself. The chance to redeem his honor, to serve his lord nobly, and to either deliver the Grail to that master, or to give up his life in the attempt, was all he ever sought. The very act of participating in the Holy Grail War was his motivation for helping and serving Cainith. Unfortunately, his master could not appreciate his fealty without accepting his own loveless marriage. His mistress saw him as nothing but a means of escape from her misery, and the master of Saber, the only person in all the war who Lancer could respect and open up to as an equal, saw his honor as nothing but a flaw to be exploited for his own pragmatic ends. That Lancer died in abject despair isn't unusual. Over the course of the Fourth Holy Grail War, many dreams were shattered, and many lives were ended. What makes Lancer's death stand out as the most tragic of all for me is the fact that for all others who met their end in the Holy Grail War, their death or downfall was always rooted, at least in part, in their own personal shortcomings. Lancer's suffering and death, by contrast, was entirely born of the shortcomings of all those around him. In that regard, It could be argued that his role in the story is to represent what becomes of honor in a realistic conflict, and that the impossibility of the ideals he tried to live by could only result in a tragic end. Or maybe, just maybe, his death is meant to make the audience feel a little bit better about the fact that Kiritsugu ultimately died a broken and pitiful man, utterly defeated by his attempt to seize the Grail. Ah well, on to the next team. Like Team Lancer, Team Caster never quite managed to make it to the center of the story, meeting their end around the series' halfway point. Unlike Team Lancer, though, Team Caster never gave the slightest care about where they fell in the plot. Indeed, neither one of them could give the slightest toss about the Holy Grail or the conflict therein. Both Ryunosuke and his servant were unrestrained forces of pure id, using their chance encounter with one another as nothing more than an opportunity to continue chasing their ideal of beauty in a more efficient manner than ever before. With that said, Ryunosuke is a pretty good example of how a character can be irredeemably evil and murderous, but still retain a fair amount of audience engagement. He's probably the most reprehensible character in the entire story, a serial killer with a body count that likely stretches into the triple digits by the end, most of whom were children. At the same time, though, he possessed an implacable disposition and a childish demeanor, which resulted in a kind of the Joker-style appeal to his character. Watching him, you definitely want him to be stopped, but you can't help but enjoy the time he spends on screen at the same time. His personality goes a long way toward that, I think. His way of thinking is so alien to how a sane human being would function that I sincerely doubt he's even capable of comprehending precisely why what he's doing is wrong in the eyes of others. A good example of this is in his introductory scene. He's creating the circle to summon Caster by boredly scribbling the symbol onto the floor using the blood from his newly killed victims, and in the background he can hear a report being made on his crime spree, with the anchor referring to him as a demon. Now, a normal human being would be offended or repulsed by this comparison. A more twisted, but still understandable human being might take it as a compliment or as a mark of pride for his workmanship. Ryunosuke? He simply ponders to himself whether or not demons like it when humans compare one another to them, so he figures he'll try to summon one just to ask them what they think about it. That kind of unorthodox thinking mixed with a childish purity is the very core of his character. In many ways, he's just as much a child as his victims, someone compelled primarily by idyllic curiosity and wonder, and who never grasped how a person was supposed to see the world. His character is static within the narrative, he has no real arc to speak of, but part of that is because he was so twisted and insane that no other character or event could possibly reach him. His insanity was like a buffer that shielded him from the rest of the world happening around him. Ryunosuke's inclusion in the story is fascinating because of how sharply his personality contrasts with all the other masters in the Holy Grail War. Every other magi is either chasing an ambition they've deluded themselves into believing they truly want, or they have a firm grasp on their true desires, but are nonetheless required to grow and mature as the events of the war play on. Not Ryunosuke. He lived and died completely honest with himself, with his only regret being that he failed to see how beautiful his own blood was long before his end. Gilles de Rais may have had a similar sense of aesthetic, but his character underwent considerably more growth over the story. The caster servant is motivated primarily by hatred, blaming both humanity itself and God for what he regards as their betrayal of his beloved Jeanne d'Arc. His wish for the Grail was to return Jeanne to life, so that he could show her the folly of her chosen way of living, and tempt her down the path of self-indulgence and hatred that he himself walked. Fortunately for Jeanne, though, he was so completely insane that he mistook the first blonde woman he encountered for her, convinced his wish had been granted, and as such his focus shifted completely from the Grail itself to save her. Toward the halfway point of the series, Gilles is given an epiphany while trying to reconcile Ryunosuke, who was having an uncharacteristic stint of sorrow after they discovered Ryder had destroyed their base. He explains his belief that God cares nothing for humanity, and uses the fact that he performed acts of great evil for many years without punishment as proof of this. Ryunosuke, however, ever seeing the world in his own unique way, argues that Caster has the wrong perspective on life. God loves humans. He simply enjoys both their joy and their suffering. Whether you're performing kind acts or inflicting pain and misery upon your fellow people, you're making God happy. So naturally he didn't punish Castor for his actions in life. This revelation inspired Castor, and he resolved to perform the greatest act of terror he could possibly manage as a way to both show his gratitude to Ryunosuke and his reaffirmed loyalty to God. As fun as they were to watch, the Castor duo were made insular by their own madness. They didn't truly interact with anyone else in the cast, and viewed the events that transpired through such a warped lens that they couldn't truly be reached by word or by deed. In a way, this makes them some of the happiest characters, since they could never be made to despair, nor to suffer. Ryunosuke dies with a smile on his face, having found an answer he didn't realize he was looking for, while we eventually learn that, somewhere in the sea of his insanity, Gilles retains a small fraction of his former self, as he has a moment's regret the instant he is stricken dead by Saber's noble phantasm. Getting to live and die without suffering, however, is a blessing that most of the characters in this story didn't get to enjoy. Case in point. Taken at face value, Kari Yamato seems to be one of the most noble characters in the entire cast. A man who sacrifices his life and endures unspeakable pain in the name of saving his young niece from a terrible fate. In truth, it's a bit more complicated than that. Oh, I'm not selling Kariya short. His determination and desire to save Sakura are absolutely sincere. But there are multiple emotions behind his decision to enter the Fourth Holy Grail War, and not all of them are positive. Saving Sakura is only one small part of his true wish. He wants to be her father, her and her sister Rin both. Naturally, this also means he wants their mother, Aoi, to be his wife. This is all fine and good. Most people want to have a family. The problem here is that the role of Aoi's husband and Rin and Sakura's father is already filled by another man fighting in the Holy Grail War. From his first action as a master to near the very end, Kariya attacks Tokiomi Tosaka to the exclusion of all else. He pursues the man and his servant with the same level of furious obsession his berserker has towards Saber. His stated reason for this is because he cannot forgive Tokiomi for allowing Zoken to adopt Sakura into the Mato family, which was indeed a terrible thing for the girl, but deep down this is also because he resents Tokiomi for being the man who has everything he ever wanted. He confronts Tokiomi verbally during the final battle with Castor, demanding to know why he allowed his own daughter to be adopted out. Despite voicing his outrage at the decision, however, he never actually explains to Tokiomi why the adoption was a bad thing, nor what was in store for Sakura as the heir of the Mato family. Personally, I read his hesitance to elaborate on his outrage to be a deliberate, if subconscious, omission. It's very likely that Tokiomi Tosaka does not know about the full truth of the Crestworms, nor about the torturous methods the Mato family employs in strengthening its heirs. If Kariya revealed the truth of his decision to him, there was a chance, however slight, that Tokiomi would express regret for the decision, and if he did, Kariya would lose the excuse he has for the hatred and animosity he feels toward him, and would be forced to acknowledge how much of his feelings about the man are rooted in his jealousy and sense of inadequacy. Kariya is the most human of all the participants in the Holy Grail War, and it's part of what makes his story so resonant and relatable. Again, I repeat, his love of Sakura and willingness to sacrifice himself to save her are genuine. I'm not trying to paint him as a selfish villain, only to show the personal flaws he possessed, which, I believe, contributed to his ultimate downfall. There was never a happy ending in store for him, but I was glad to find he was at least granted mercy in his end, being allowed to die while in the grips of a delusion, convinced he had saved Sakura and obtained the family he always wanted. I'm not a big fan of Kariya's story as a narrative, though. It's a bit of what TV tropes would call a shaggy dog story in and of itself, with its only lasting impact being to complement the character arc of Sakura during the Heaven's Feel route of the original Fate Stay Night. That said, there was sincere emotional weight to his character. He embodied fighting for love, all the positive and all the negative aspects of it. Both his single-minded obsession with his foe and the strong emotions that guided him into the Holy Grail War are perfectly in sync with his servant Berserker. The constraints of his class made it hard to really get a grasp for Lancelot until very near his end. Mad Enhancement may have served to make him a more formidable foe in battle, but it did quite the number on his ability to articulate his feelings. He seemed to be a character with an intense self-loathing, almost certainly connected to his past history with Arthur and Guinevere in The Legend of Camelot. And the madness brought about by being summoned as a berserker turned his self-loathing outward and made him lash out at Arturia. This made him quite the painful foe for her in the endgame of the Holy Grail War, an opportunity that Kire used to great satisfaction. But the limits of being a berserker and having his motives hidden until the very end of his arc made it hard to appreciate him as his own character. Getting ever closer to the characters most central to the story, we arrive at Team Rider. As a contrast to the various tragedies that embody the stories of other masters, Waver's plotline in Fate Zero is a pure coming-of-age tale. We watch him grow and self-actualize over the course of the tale, rather than watch him slowly be undone by his own shortcomings. He and Iskandar are very much the heart of the story, if not the focus, the point of levity that helps prevent the audience from succumbing to the darkness and despair of the heavy material. They are more than simple clowns, however, and Waver in particular has a very distinct and very likable arc over the course of the story. Waver begins the story on a path that would likely see him grow into a carbon copy of Lancer's master Cainith. He too sees his personal value only in the acknowledgement of others, and thus determines his actions and ambitions not by what would make him personally happiest, but by what would lead to the greatest praise and envy from the society he was trying to be accepted into. A side effect of this was a bit of self-destructive arrogance, less in the form of his boasting, but more in his refusal to acknowledge that he had any limitations, or an insistence that any faults or failures he is party to are the result of those around him, rather than himself. As such, it was nothing shy of a blessing for him that his servant was Iskandar, and watching Waver mature as a result of their relationship, watching him gradually transition from viewing Ryder as a boastful nuisance to eventually regarding him as someone worthy of respect and emulation, was a delight for me. One of the strongest suits of Fate Zero is the fact that everyone except Waver in the principal cast is well into adulthood. This means that their actions have the weight of experience behind them, and they have greater maturity and forethought than the typical anime teenagers. But it's also where the tragedy of their characters come from. As adults, they've already chosen their paths in life. The sunken cost fallacy has taken root, and they keep progressing toward the end, convinced that it's far too late to change or redefine themselves. Waver, being the only teenager in the cast, allows his subversion of this to be refreshing, rather than cliché. Waver hasn't started down his path yet. He remains at the crossroads of his life, and thus the Fourth Holy Grail War represents the moment where he discovers himself, rather than the moment when the actions of his life are weighed and measured. Waver isn't a bad kid. His flaw is in his perspective, and he comes to this realization fairly quickly for how young he is. He goes from blaming Ryder for being too hot-headed to accept him, to feeling guilty and inadequate as his master, to realizing that his life is something precious, and he has nothing he wants to risk it for in the Holy Grail War. When he finally gives up his command seals to empower Iskandar before their final battle, it's not treated as an act of cowardice or self-deprecation, but rather as the mature decision of an adult. He wasn't fit to be a master in the Holy Grail War, but his courage made him more than worthy to stand beside Ryder until the end, and to be acknowledged by his king as a valued retainer and friend. By contrast, Ryder himself doesn't change all that much. But this is because he, much like Ryunosuke, was already living true to himself, and never had occasion to doubt or question his way of life throughout the story. Upon the moment of his death, he realizes that Okeanis represented the beating of his own heart, that he carried his dream with him, and the act of pursuing his dream was the dream itself. However, this epiphany was more about Ryder finally realizing a value he'd always had, rather than something that he developed over the course of his journey. Iskandar never planned to use the Grail to conquer the world, only to give him the means to try to conquer it himself. He always moved forward without doubt or hesitation, and his spirit would survive him in the hearts of all who followed him. Iskandar dies in the end, and Waver grieves him. But the loss of his servant's body is far from the end of him. His heart had been passed on to his retainer, and now the task of marching boldly toward his dreams and spreading the fire of Iskandar's conquest to the hearts of those to follow fell upon Waver. In a series where so much of the cast is consumed by their vices and sent down a path of self-destruction, Waver's story is an overtly positive tale of maturity and self-discovery, and Fate Zero is much stronger for having it.